Okay, so we're now going to look at session 3. Here's the folder, and as usual, there's a Google Slides presentation and a student worksheet. Okay, so the slides presentation drives this thing, and it looks very similar to the other ones. This one is called Under the Cultural Iceberg. You could also call it Classifying Cultures. So I guess the first thing would be to remind the students of session 1. So in session 1 there's a slide near the beginning of the session when we're trying to kind of mop up after the exercise with the quotations about culture, where the students have to kind of arrive at a definition, a working definition of the word culture. So there's a slide in that has an iceberg, and the statement is that culture is manifested at different degrees of depth. Okay, so when we're interacting or we're communicating cross-culturally, there are things that we notice are different on this, above the waterline, things that we can see, like it's different language, it's different clothes, it's different gestures, etc. And then there are things that are more implicit or kind of insidious below the surface, things like values and beliefs, attitudes, for example. So in this session, we're classifying cultures according to the research of Dutch social psychologist Geert Hofstede, and his cultural orientations, as he calls them, are kind of large scale kind of value orientations that differ from culture to culture. So that's where this term under the cultural iceberg comes in. From the beginning, we just have to remind the students of the cultural iceberg. Now that's quite simple because the first activity is about a cultural iceberg. Okay, so plan is we're going to look at stereotypes versus heuristics. We're going to introduce the cultural orientations, Geert Hofstede's cultural orientations, and then and then the students basically apply that theory to practice and kind of play around with these orientations. Okay. Now I've done this session many times, and I've never done the warmer. Okay, so this would be the warmer for this. The reason that I've never done it is because I want to always leave time at the end for the students to play around with the orientations. Otherwise, it's a quite dry and theoretical presentation. It's really when they start applying it to practice that it really comes alive for them, and there's some excellent links, interactive websites where they can check hypotheses. It's very illuminating. I always want to leave a lot of time for that. So whether you do this is up to you. But if I was to do it, I would do it reasonably quickly. Okay. So basically, this is the cultural iceberg. I've just explained what it is. In this session, we go under the cultural iceberg. So we repeat this learning outcome that culture is manifested at different degrees of depth. Now we want the students to complete their own cultural iceberg using prompts in the word cloud. Okay. So basically, you have this picture on the screen, and you get the students either with posters. You can get a big piece of poster for this, or A2, A3 paper, and get them to draw an iceberg where 10% is above the surface and 90% is below. Then they actually I think this is all, yeah, it's all on the worksheet, so you don't necessarily need to get them to draw the iceberg. Okay, so this is the worksheet. You give them this iceberg, you give them the word cloud, and the idea is they have to, together in groups, decide which of these are obvious about their own culture or UK culture, and which ones are less obvious and belong under the iceberg. Okay, and for each of these, in order to justify the position, they have to give some examples. So they might say facial expressions. Well, that comes above the iceberg. That's obvious. We can see that they're different. And an example of that would be, for example, smiling. So, for example, in my culture, if it's someone perhaps who's culturally Thai from Thailand, smiling is very common in that culture. It's socially motivated behavior, whereas in Russia, quite famously, smiling is less common, and perhaps even a sign that you are a little bit perhaps foolish. Okay, so this is a kind of warmer activity, getting them to think about patterns of difference above and below the iceberg. Okay. So, as I say, I would keep the activity quite short if you do it. Otherwise, the lesson begins here. So the students are going to watch 2 adverts which were created some years ago to promote HSBC as the world's local bank. So you want to elicit what the students know about HSBC Bank, the fact that it's Hong Kong based, and that it had a slogan like the world's local bank. It's common in high streets in Britain too. Now, these 2 adverts show people from different cultures interacting, and there's some kind of confusion or possibly offence in each case. And one of the things we want to ask the students is, how would they describe the problem or the difference in each case? And secondly, would they describe the depictions of national cultures in these adverts as stereotypes? Why and why not? Okay. And you'll see the 2 videos now. Okay, so moving on to the next slide then. So they've seen the videos and the students have answered the 2 questions. Okay, they've tried to describe the problem in each case, and they've talked about whether or not these representations of cultural behaviour constitute stereotypes. Now, you can see fairly obvious in the first advert, it's to do with personal space. So in Mexico, for example, we have a personal space is much a smaller area than, for example, Europeans, especially Northern Europeans. And the second one is about, I guess, it's following rules, it's respect for authority. Yeah, it's these kind of things, using France and Germany as contrasting examples. So we're really interested in the idea of stereotypes here, and we begin by referencing a definition of stereotypes from I think it was the first session. Yeah, is a fixed, oversimplified, and uninformed image of a group. Okay, and then we asked students 2 questions. If a person visits a foreign country once and forms an impression of that society, is that a stereotype? And we ask a related question, which is if a person visits a foreign country multiple times, studies their culture and language, and forms an evidence-based impression of that society to help her understand and communicate better, is that a stereotype? Okay. So basically, what we're trying to do is we're assuming that the students know that stereotypes are a barrier to intercultural competency. I mean, we don't have to assume that because we told them this in the first session, right? My experience tends to be that students see stereotypes everywhere, and they are maybe too quick to reject past the point of normal criticality representations of cultural behavior which are in some sense generalizations. Okay, so these two questions are trying to lay the foundations for a more nuanced concept, which we will introduce as being a cultural heuristic, which is rather than being a fixed, oversimplified, and uninformed image of a group, it's a labile, it's flexible, it's highly informed, and it is information rich image of a group. Okay. So you get them to discuss these questions, and you have a plenary, and you get some interesting answers. And then what we want them to do is actually, before we go to the next slide, we want them to read a text. Okay. Now the text is after it's on the worksheet, and it's after the iceberg activity. Okay. So what I'm going to do is you can read this yourself, obviously, in preparation. The key points here are that we need to generalize about groups in order to live our daily lives, basically. There's a practical, it's expedient in some circumstances to generalize on the basis of informed sort of a critical reflective image you have of a group. Okay, so the example is a company that's selling car insurance. They ask customers about their age, how many years they've been driving, their type of car, their gender, and they're doing that in order to assess how likely it is that a person will have a particular accident. Okay, or an accident in general. So they extract a pattern from the answers from the answers. They extract a pattern from the answers that you give, and they match that pattern against other applicants for whom they have existing records of claims. Okay, so that is generalizing and bracketing someone as belonging to some risk brackets. Okay. Secondly, you have this example about a woman who, the first time she visits Brazil for sales, she's surprised, but she's surprised by the differences in the culture, and she felt that her communication was not effective, not efficient. She then applies herself to studying Portuguese, to learning about the culture, and to observing without judgment on each subsequent visit, right? Trying to reconstruct what's under the Brazilian iceberg, trying to reconstruct the perspective or the filter of the other. Okay. Now, after 25 years, she has developed a deep understanding of Brazil, which she can use as a cultural filter to cautiously interpret the behavior of new clients that she meets. Okay. So the question is, does she have a stereotype of Brazil? And I think most reasonable people would argue, no, we need a different word for the kind of hypotheses that she's making about these individuals. So this word is cultural heuristic. Okay, so the students have read this text. And at the end of the text, there's some key points which we have on the next slide. Okay, so this is a summary of what we want the students to take away from this, which is the fact that stereotypes are fixed, oversimplified, and uninformed generalizations. They exist to mask ignorance, foster feelings of superiority, and facilitate quick wholesale judgments. Cultural heuristics, on the other hand, are evidence-based, working hypotheses of a culture as a whole. They exist to enhance understanding and communication by helping reconstruct the other's perspective, okay? Helping to sort of flesh out what's under the cultural iceberg. Cultural heuristics are only valid, so this is a kind of salient sort of warning, in order that cultural heuristics don't slip into stereotypes. So they're only valid if they emerge from a critical mass of experience and reflection. Okay, so data is very important here. They are used with caution and continuing reflection to understand the group as a whole, and they are not used to make valid judgments of individuals. Okay, so this is the awareness that when you generalize a pattern that holds for a group as a tendency, when you generalize that to one individual, there is always scope that generalization will not be valid. Okay, because of the differences that exist within sameness. This is one of the key points from the first session, that culture is a fuzzy set, and there'll be paradigmatic examples of individuals who kind of match the average behavior of the group, and there'll be outliers within that. So when we're using these cultural heuristics, they are valid as generalizations for a large sample of people, but we should not use them unreflectingly as kind of binding promises of what a particular individual will behave and talk and be like. Okay. And lastly, they are continually tested against reality and adapted or rejected if found to be false. Okay, so that's the fact that culture is always subject to change, and that a generalization which is found to obtain for one particular culture at one particular time will drift, will be subject to change, and will need to be updated, adapted or rejected in the face of new evidence. Okay, so really for anyone who's done social science research, this should be very clear. Okay, because what we're talking about is generalizing from samples to individuals. Okay, so it's a process of deduction, and as every good social scientist knows, the larger the sample, the more valid and reliable your inferences are going to be, but they will break down because you cannot expect a specific case to adopt the behavior of the group as a whole. Okay, now it might seem that I'm laboring this. It's very important because it lays the foundation for what's coming next. Okay, so what is coming next? So the next part of this presentation is introducing the work of Geert Hofstede, who is still alive. He's a Dutch social psychologist and anthropologist, and in the 1970s he was working for IBM, and IBM, being one of the first global companies, had branches all across the world, and IBM wanted to streamline, to make more efficient communication between international branches of its organization. So it commissioned Geert to do a survey of national values among its 117,000 employees. So it was a social science experiment. There was a survey which was a questionnaire tool, or a set of questionnaire tools which were developed and standardized and piloted, and then they were sent out to samples from different countries, and the data was collected and statistics were done and conclusions were arrived at. So the conclusions that Hofstede originally arrived at came in the form of 4 cultural orientations or 4 dimensions. Okay, each of these dimensions describes the way a culture has chosen to solve a problem which all societies face. Okay, so this is the first of the 4 dimensions. It's called power distance. And here the central problem that the culture has to face is, how do we deal with differences in wealth and status? Okay, no society is equal. There are differences in power, in privilege, in wealth, in status. So how do we deal with those? Okay, so in so-called high power distance cultures, status differences are natural and right, and they should be recognized and respected. Okay, so for example, respecting the authority of the teacher just because he or she is a teacher is a high power distance kind of behavior. So following rules, respect for authority, showing deference to different speakers because with the way that you adapt your language. So Japanese has honorifics, so a complicated set of addresses that you would use to show respect to someone who's a higher status than you. We can do this in English just by using Mr. or Mrs. or just using slightly more formal requests. Okay. Low power distance is everyone is equal. Status differences are the result of artificial conventions, and they should be minimized. Okay. So status differences do exist, but they are of no real intrinsic merit, and we do not need to acknowledge or codify them in our behavior and language. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these as you would go through them, and then you will see how to help the students flesh out these categories. Okay. So secondly, individualism and collectivism. The central problem here is, how do we balance self-fulfillment with duty to others? Okay. So extreme individualism, individual freedom is the greatest virtue. Self-expression and self-fulfillment are the greatest goals. Okay. Group harmony is the greatest virtue, and close and strong relationships with the in-group is the greatest goal. That's extreme collectivism. Okay, so you might want to pause and ask the students, well, can you think of a society which is extremely individualistic society? And if they said something like America, they would be absolutely right. You can ask them for extremely collectivist society, and they might come up with Japan, China, for example. You can also point out that in individualist societies, there's lots of words with self, right? So self-discipline, self-control, self-fulfillment, self-respect, and lots of there's a tendency to use I rather than we. Okay, so it's interesting. You're just kind of noting these things and sort of like suggesting to the students that these things are under the cultural iceberg, but they can bubble up to the top, and they can affect language and vocabulary, things like that. Okay, masculinity, femininity. Now, this is quite an unfortunately named orientation. As you can see from the asterisk, it's also termed tough versus tender cultures. The reason that Hofstede named this thus is because it's to do with the central problem here. The central problem is, what are the social consequences of your biological sex, and how differentiated should gender roles be? So we have, in extremely masculine cultures, gender roles are sharply differentiated. Okay, masculine role emphasizes material success, competition, and conflict, and conversely, the feminine role it emphasizes the appropriateness of more of submissive, caring, cooperative behavior. Okay, in extremely feminine cultures, then the gender roles are seen as being equal. So men and women can do the same kinds of things and should do the same kinds of things. Certain behaviors aren't gendered like they are in masculine cultures. Okay, and there's a tendency for both roles to emphasize care, compromise, and modesty. Okay, so this orientation is about two things basically. It's about how differentiated should gender roles be, and it's about this polarity between the material success, competition, and conflict being the sort of appropriate behavior for men who take part in public life, and compromise and modesty and care for both genders equally partaking in public life. Okay, so you can ask the question, which countries do you think are mostly masculine, mostly feminine? And it would be good to think about gender differences here. So a key concept here is maternity or paternity leave. Okay, so in which country does legislation encourage men to take, if not as long a period of paternity as women, then approaching as long a time of paternity leave as women? Which countries legislate for that? And the answer would be Scandinavia, which are very good examples of feminine societies. Okay, masculine societies. So you can make the observation that something that I have observed time and time again. In a classroom of Japanese students, the girls sit on one side and the boys sit on the other, and they don't normally mix together, do pair work together, or group work. There's a kind of resistance to that. It's a good example of a very masculine country. Okay, and the last one is uncertainty, avoidance, and tolerance. So here the central problem is, how do we deal with uncertainty and risk? So the future is always uncertain. No one knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So how do you deal with that? Do you embrace risk? In which case you're extreme uncertainty tolerant. Openness is the greatest virtue. Curiosity and exploration are encouraged. Or do you try to minimize risk? So certainty is the greatest virtue. Difference is dangerous. Rules and structure are necessary and good. Okay. So you can ask, think of cultures which would tend to be more extreme uncertainty avoidant. And according to Hofstede's data, Greece is the most uncertainty avoidant country in the world, but it might be more interesting to ask, what are the most uncertainty tolerant of countries? Okay, and here it might surprise you to understand that the UK is actually a very uncertainty tolerant country. But you look at the fact that we don't have a written constitution. We don't ask our citizens to carry identity cards. We kind of make some of the slogans to do with English culture is keep calm and carry on, make do and mend, muddle through. The English kind of compromise, the middle way. So being okay with ambivalence and uncertainty and compromise is something which we I think it's true that we do. We're quite tolerant of that. Okay. Japan is another example of an uncertainty avoidant country, and if you look back at the history of its the amount of natural disasters that it can be subject to, volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunami, then you can see why perhaps the individuals or society on that island would be more keen on avoiding risk. Okay. Okay. So you introduce these orientations, and then the rest of the session is basically over to the students. Okay. So your tutor will now give you a summary of Hofstede's first 4 orientations, and they have to answer 3 questions. Okay. They have to identify their native country's culture somewhere on the spectrum, and they have to give reasons for their choice. Okay. Now, it's much better if the students are working in multicultural groups here, and I would encourage classroom management that brings that about. So groups of maybe 3 or 4 here. Identify alternative cultures that might occupy more extreme positions at either end. Okay, so we kind of did that with the presentation, and we spoke about paradigmatic extreme examples of these cultures, and when they have finished with this these questions, then they can check their guesses against Hofstede's original data in 2 different formats. Okay, so let me just show you the materials that go along with this. Okay, so this is session 3, and the students get a copy in the appendix here of each of the orientations. Okay, so this one is individualism and collectivism. Down the side you can see a scale. Okay, so that scale is between here at the top, extreme individualism, and here at the bottom, extreme collectivism. Okay, so they have to place their country's culture somewhere on this scale. Okay, to help them do that, they can look at the core value or the core distinction of each pole of the orientation. Right. So, extreme individualism is one pole of the orientation, and extreme collectivism is the other pole. They can look at the 5 key elements of this pole, words with a positive connotation, and they can look at some non-verbal and linguistic behavior. Okay, they can do the same with the other end of the orientation, the other pole. And then they want to think about which countries would occupy extreme positions. Okay, so they do that in small groups for each orientation. Now, this involves reading, it involves thinking, it involves coming up with examples which satisfy a rule, it involves hypothesizing, it involves responding to members of the group, maybe criticizing or challenging certain propositions that are made. Okay, and it involves note taking too. Okay, because at the end of the day, we're going to check our guesses against Hofstede's data. Okay, that's what makes this session quite interesting, actually. So once the students have answered these 2 questions here, you can ask them to enter these links. Okay, so we're just going to open this first link. Okay, so this takes us to a country comparison tool on Hofstede's website. So say, for example, you come from the UK. Okay, and you have the impression that the UK has high power distance. Okay, you're thinking about the class system. You're thinking about the House of Lords, you're thinking about the Queen holding it all together, and your hypothesis is the UK is pretty high power distance. Okay, so you type in United Kingdom here, and you have a readout. Okay, power distance is 35. Okay, which is quite low. Okay, so here we can go down and we can read sorry, we have to open, read more about chosen countries. Okay, we open this one, and we can read about power distance. Okay, so a general description of what the orientation or that pole, sorry, that orientation is, and specific information about Britain. Okay, so here we have at 35, Britain sits in the lower rankings of PDI, a society that believes that inequalities amongst people should be minimized. Okay, and you can go on and you can read some of the rationale for Hofstede placing the UK so low. So when I have done this with students, they've found this fascinating. They've been unable to move on to the next stage of the lesson because they want to learn more about this. And also, there's quite a lot of Hofstede is wrong. He's wrong. Okay, which is great because that is really engaging with these orientations. Okay, now. Here is power distance, here is individualism, here is masculinity, here is uncertainty avoidance. Here is another two orientations. Now, after the original research in the 70s, Hofstede added two more. Well, he did the survey again, and he added two more orientations. Okay, we don't look at these orientations in this session because 4 is enough for this session. Okay, but it's worth flagging that up to students. Okay, now the great thing about this is you can put in other countries. Okay, so let's put Japan in here. Okay, so you can see that there's a big difference between uncertainty avoidance between Japan and the United Kingdom. Okay, now when you get this kind of data, you might want to ask the students, okay, so can you think of potential communication breakdowns between Japanese and English that might be more common than others? Okay, and you might talk about having deadlines, having fixed agreements, etc. Okay, you can actually put in more than 2 countries, and you can read about each of the countries. Okay, so this is a great tool for this kind of activity. The second link takes you to the same data, but it's in table format. Okay, so we want to look at let's look at power distance again. Okay, and again you have a little description here, and then you have a table. Okay, so here you have countries with the highest power distance index come at the top. Okay, and with the lowest ones at the bottom here. Okay, so you can. This is useful for the question of what countries do you think come at the extremes. Okay, and if anything's puzzling here, for example, we might think that Austria at Livin for like very low power distance is quite puzzling. Of course, we can put it into Hofstede's website. Okay, okay. So that's the follow up after this slide. I'm just going to finish now. Now this would not be complete. This session would not be complete without thinking about the limitations of Hofstede's data. Okay, so the point we want students to understand is that Hofstede's orientations are useful heuristics to bear in mind when thinking about cultural difference. Okay, our default tendency is towards ethnocentrism and therefore judging others by what's under our own cultural iceberg, using our own cultural filter. Hofstede's data allows us to have another starting point. Okay, but we will still have to calibrate from that other starting point. I think that's the point I want to emphasize here. So at their most basic, they describe fundamental ways in which other cultures can differ from our own. However, they should always be used critically with an awareness of their limitations, okay? So these include the fact that alternative systems for analysing cultures exist, okay? So you can point students in direction of the work of Richard Lewis and Fons Trompena. The usual limitations of reliability, validity, and relevance that pertain to any empirical study in the social sciences, okay? So depends how big his sample size was. It depends on the validity of the statistical tools that he used in order to come to his inferences, and it depends on when the data was collected and when it was analysed, okay? And thirdly, every society is composed of individuals with their own psychological orientations, okay? So this is saying that there is difference in sameness and sameness in difference, yeah. We might want to point students in the direction of the Big Five personality test, okay, which takes survey data for individuals and classifies individuals according to a pre-existing orientations of personality, okay. So this is the caveats here, and the last point is, of course, the learning outcomes. So as a result of this session, we should now have a better understanding of the composition of our own cultural iceberg, that's SP, specific knowledge, the difference between stereotypes and cultural heuristics, theoretical knowledge, Geert de Hofstede's first 4 cultural orientations, that's theoretical knowledge about cultures, how to classify them in general, how specific cultures, including your own, are situated relative to Hofstede's 8 synthetic cultures. That is specific knowledge, okay? So the 8 synthetic cultures would be the 8 poles. So there's 4 orientations. Each orientation has 2 poles. Another word for these poles would be a synthetic culture, okay? So called because no culture occupies an extreme position at the end, okay? And the limitations of Hofstede's orientations, okay? So that's it for session 3.